If you're a frequent viewer of our show, you know we try to bring you guests who are expert in the metaphysical realm, the creative arts, and the healing arts. And I think our guest today can cover all three. He's actually the author of over 25 books, which is incredible. You can see him a lot on the internet. He's a world speaker on spiritual topics. It gives us great pleasure to welcome back Mr. Stephen Knapp. Stephen.
Robert, thanks so much. Glad to be here again.
And today we're going to talk about a very important subject, world peace. In fact, your book there, Towards World Peace, a very important topic, especially today in our world. As we were saying earlier on, we've turned 60.
Is that how old we are? Wait a minute. When did that happen?
And in our lifetime alone, oh my gosh, all the conflicts, that have happened on the world. But
Yeah.
now you mentioned the Bhagavad Gita, and we're talking about peace. But the Bhagavad Gita was spoken on a battlefield.
Oh my God. What do you make of that?
Yeah, that's a contradiction, isn't it?
No, not really, because the battle was based on the idea of protecting the principles of Dharma. It wasn't about taking over someone's land or conquering something or, shoving down a philosophy or religion into somebody else's throat, but it was basically because you had these culprits that would not even give proper facility for their relatives and their kingdom, their subjects, that they were supposed to give. So it was basically a war to protect the dharmic or uplifting principles of humanity, as opposed to just quarreling over tribal property or possessions and resources. So that was the whole point of and that was why even Arjuna, one of the people in the prime characters in the Bhagavad Gita, he didn't want to fight.
Yeah.
He said, "What is the point of this? I'd rather just go off to meditate in the woods." Well, that sounds reasonable. But the point of it was, if sometimes you have to stand up for the righteous principles, otherwise they'll simply be neglected completely.
So you're not a pacifist. You would actually say there is a place for the military in our world.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's the way it is. I mean, basically, military itself will never provide peace. Making bigger and bigger weapons will never provide peace. Like they say, if you got a gun, at some point you're going to want to shoot it. So this is not what we're meant for. This is not the goal of life on earth. This is not the goal of human life.
Mm-hmm.
But the point of it is, there are those classifications of people that without the threat of repercussion of some kind, they're going to go, and do whatever they want and harm all kinds of people and basically put aside whatever dharmic or righteous principles there are to do whatever they want.
So there's
it's kind of like, the old saying that, you teach an animal with a stick. You have to have a little force.
Yeah.
That either do this and you'll be rewarded, you do that, you'll be punished.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that's the way it is in some ways. But higher than that, we have to understand that, as one saying in one of my books, Toward World Peace here, there's a saying from the Taoist scripture called the Chuang Tzu, verse 11, which says, "Men of this world all rejoice in others being like themselves, and object to others not being like themselves." So what does that mean? It means our differences stem from what is obviously a very superficial way of looking at each other.
Yeah.
We have to go deeper than that. We have to not just simply recognize our differences, but we have to recognize a core focus, a core goal of understanding who and what we really are as spiritual beings.
Yeah.
Because there's always going to be differences between our bodies, between the way we look, between our countries, between our habits, diets, clothing, styles, whatever. But there's more to it than that. Even on the most superficial level, take away anything spiritual. Even on the most superficial level, all of us know that we're all in this world together, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what does that mean? That means the more you help me, the more I help you, the easier it gets for both of us. So why can't people understand that? Why can't we begin to work together on that level? But to go even deeper than that means that we should uplift our consciousness so that we can actually begin to recognize the spiritual nature within both of us, which are completely the same. You know, so this is one thing that has to be understood. Another quote in here, which I have, also recognizes the difference, which is basically the superficiality, which we call in the Vedic tradition called Maya, or illusion.
The world of duality.
The world of duality, exactly. And this is from the Bhagavad Purana. It says, fatness, thinness, bodily and mental distress, even thirst and hunger, fear, disagreement, desires for material happiness, old age, sleep, attachment for material possessions, anger when you don't get those possessions, because that's basically what the stemming of anger is, or even lamentation if you have something and lose it. Illusion and identification of the body are all transformations of the material covering of the spirit soul. It's not the spirit soul. So a person absorbed in the material bodily conception is affected by these things. But the soul is free from all bodily conceptions and all bodily conditions. Consequently, the spirit soul is neither fat nor skinny, nor anything else you may consider. It's more than that. So it's more than just being a Christian or a Hindu or a Muslim or a Jew or
white, black,
or any of that stuff.
Male, female.
It's all part of the illusion which, as humans, we should eagerness to raise our consciousness to see through that, to see beyond that. Otherwise, quite honestly, the Vedic scripture says that until you raise your consciousness above that, basically you're still nothing more than a polished animal. We want to be human beings, not just polished animals. We should go higher than that. So this is what we need to do.
But we're living in a culture today where the philosophy is greed is good. Greed is good.
Well, you see that for a while, but usually that wears out pretty fast.
But our whole culture is based on, competition, survival of the fittest.
Our whole culture is actually based on trying to satisfy the mind and senses. It's part of the superficial arrangement, the part of the superficial body that covers the soul. We still haven't reached the soul yet.
Right.
It's also said that until the soul is satisfied, the mind is always agitated. So until we get to the root of the tree, how can you satisfy the tree, the branches and the leaves? So you have to water the root of the tree. Otherwise, the leaves are still going to be crying out for water. The mind is the same way. Until you get to the root of the individual, which is the spirit soul of the spiritual person within the body, the mind is always going to be asking and crying out for more attention, more needs, more wants, more desires. There's no end to it.
Yeah.
You're never happy on that level.
If I remember from the Bhagavad Gita, there's that verse that Mother Nature is endlessly mutable.
Yes.
Yeah. There's no end.
There's no end. Because if you live on the mental platform, I mean, you may say that I just want a good meal. But listen, after a good meal, the mind always comes up with something else. Now, if I had ice cream, oh yeah, if I had some ice cream. No, so you get some ice cream. Now, if I just had, maybe a cigarette. Oh, if I just had a cigarette to wind everything up, Oh, well, a cigarette and maybe a beer. Okay, let's go with the beer. Then you get the beer, and then, okay, I've got everything, but, I think there's a show on TV about now. I'd really like to watch this movie. The mind is always thinking of something.
Yeah.
And it's that eternal and eternal conversation that we're always having with the mind, which is always telling us what we want. And then the intelligence kicks in with a plan to how to satisfy that desire.
That's like that. There's that great Platonian example of the soul is the passenger in the chariot.
Oh yeah.
And the driver of the chariot's the intellect. The reins are like the mind. And then the 5 horses are the senses.
That's in the Katha Upanishad.
Is that right?
The Katha Upanishad explains that. The soul is like simply the passenger of the chariot. The chariot is the body. So it's the same thing as we get in our car. We don't think we're the car, but at the same time, if you hit my car, I get out of the car and I say, you hit me.
Yeah.
But actually you didn't hit me, you hit my car. So we have to understand that the vehicle, this body is simply a vehicle, which has so many differentiations between one and another. But the soul, the passenger within the vehicle, is simply the same as one and the other. They're all the same.
Kind of
So
a
we're
dim-
also connected in that way. We're, as being children of the Supreme Father, we're all connected as part of the one reality, the ultimate reality. So if we get to that level of understanding that one ultimate reality, or God, then we can also understand that in that sense we're also very, very similar.
So we're all part of God's energy.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So there's only God and God's energy.
Exactly.
Yeah. And material means seeing the self separate from everybody.
Right. I see you as separate from me. You're from England. I'm from America. I don't like you. And you might not like me because I'm a crass, rough around the edges American or something like that.
Yeah.
Not having the big picture. And the
Yeah.
big picture for us is that, ultimately our parents all came from Europe.
Right.
Yours is from England. I've got some English blood in me. So we're actually not all that different. We just have to have the big picture involved to understand that our real roots are very much the same. And spiritually, our roots are all the same.
So not only you're saying that we should see each other, the human beings, spiritually, all of creation has that same spiritual identity.
Right. It's like in this book, the 11th Commandment, which I call the 11th Commandment, because the 10 Commandments are basically moralistic principles. They're not really spiritual principles. So let's introduce something really spiritual, which in this case I came up with, thou shalt. Thou shalt recognize the divinity in all living beings, and that the Spirit in all life is part of the Supreme Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And then I wrote this book which contains all the information. If you actually put this knowledge to use, and use that as part of one of your commandments to live by, then it would change the way you look at other people, the way you look at yourself, the way you look at nature, the way you do business with other people. International politics would change. Who we choose as a president would change. All these different aspects of life.
So you're saying wherever there's consciousness, wherever there's a living being who is feeling, like our dog or our cat, there is a soul.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we have to understand that. We need to understand that. And if we actually understood that soul is no different than my soul, we would all be more eager to work together, to cooperate together, to make this world a better place, and it would all make a change in the way we treat each other, which is why I call it the next step in social spiritual development.
Yeah.
That commandment itself.
So you're living your life seeing everything as sacred.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
That's what it is. It's also part of God's energy.
Yeah.
We're part of God's energy. Everything around us is part of God's energy.
There's nothing but God's energy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But we have to raise our consciousness up to be able to perceive that. If we don't, then basically we're still acting as, brutish cavemen, basically.
Because there are religions on the planet, major religions, who have that vision, the world is evil and God is great.
Or they're the chosen ones, and they're the exceptionals, and everybody else is going to hell because they don't follow my path.
Right.
But oftentimes those same religions don't just say that about other religions, they say it about other clans within the same religion.
Exactly.
So then there's no peace.
Yeah. So they're not really, in terms of spiritual vision, not really even at the ABCs.
Where is their spiritual vision?
Yeah. Where is that? When you can, violently kill another living being, that cannot be any kind of spiritual realization.
That is something that does not come from God, but it comes from man's speculation. And sometimes it's a political operative within that religion which establishes those things. It's not really a spiritual discipline at all.
Many times we've seen it that really it's a political issue, not a religious issue.
Right.
Even when we look at Northern Ireland, the trouble there between the Catholics and the Protestants,
Yeah.
it is a political issue. It's not anything to do with spirituality.
Yeah, they're both Christians.
Yeah.
And they still can't get along. Or it's like the Shias and the Sunnis of Islam.
Yeah.
They don't get along.
I can't get why you get upset about a guy in Denmark doing a cartoon and you go and blow up Allah's mosque. I don't get that.
I have no explanation for that either. I'm sure they'll come up with something, but it makes no sense to me.
Yeah, that is a holy place, no matter who, which sect is a part of that.
Right.
Yeah. So, what is the solution?
Well, basically,
Because it's, you know, one of the things you talked about, Bhagavad Gita, they talk about the soul being inconceivable, invisible. How is it possible for your average person to raise their consciousness to that spiritual sacred level?
well, you have to be able to practice. You have to practice your spiritual path. You have to practice understanding this higher knowledge. You have to acquire it first. And then read it, absorb it, study it, and then participate in the spiritual process, which spiritualizes your consciousness. The whole point of it is, the more spiritual you become, the more spiritual you are, the more you can perceive that which is spiritual around you. In other words, your consciousness rises to the higher dimension by which you see everything that's spiritual around you.
Yeah.
And then you act on that level. It's not just a theory, it's a perception. It's a recognition of that spirituality, that spiritual dimension.
Actually, spirit is everywhere.
Absolutely.
There's nothing but.
I compare it to radio waves. Radio waves are everywhere, but you can't see them. But if you have a good receiver, then there's so many radio waves you can tune into. The same thing. If you're spiritual, if your consciousness is spiritual enough, you'll begin to see all that spiritual dimension around you all the time. And you'll be able to interact with that spiritual dimension as a reality, not as a fictional story or a theory.
So instead of treating somebody different as an enemy, you're treating them in a sacred way, because you're
Right.
seeing the soul, you're seeing the spirit within. And that goes not just for the humans, but all living beings, the dogs, the cats,
Right.
the insects, the trees.
And then the goal is to bring everybody else, or give everybody else that opportunity to also reach that higher perception, that higher state of being and reality.
I heard a statement that from the Vedic tradition that if only 3% of the planet had that consciousness, they could transform the planet.
And why is that?
That's powerful.
That's because when you bring down the higher dimension, the higher vibrations of reality, that will also begin to have its effect, if only on your own sphere of influence to begin with. But then it begins to vibrate more at a greater distance than that. So as it vibrates on a greater distance, everybody else begins to feel that. They also become a little calmer, a little more peaceful. Their consciousness also begins to rise up. They begin to see things a little more differently, so that 3% becomes 5%, becomes 10%, and then it expands like that.
Yeah.
That's how it grows, and that's what we need to try to do, at least for those of us that know that simply bigger weapons and more weapons aren't going to create, a more peaceful earth. It just isn't going to happen that way.
We need that vision. Yeah.
Absolutely.
We're not Muslims, we're not Hindus, we're not black, we're not white, we're not male, we're not female. We're all souls, and we're all in this together.
And you can understand that most of these religions had a relatively modern origin. They were not around for long periods of time. So a lot of the quarrel that comes about these particular religions can also be set aside simply by rising above the constraints that may be in that particular philosophy or rhetoric.
We want to thank you for joining us again, Stephen.
Okay.
Always very great wisdom.
Okay.
And we have been showing Stephen's website and his email, etc. If you want to get more information about his many books, you can just go on, Google him, and you can find him. He does blogs and all sorts of stuff. So I want to thank you also for joining us on Out of the Ordinary into the Extraordinary. Don't forget, as Stephen will agree, God is alive. Magic is afoot.